Good evening and welcome to a new edition of To The Point. This evening with the distinguished gentleman will be digging into the African Union. Within a few days, Egypt will be officially heading the African Union or chairing the African Union. The president has a lot of ambitious plans and goals, social, economic and political reform. What do we need to do at this juncture? How can we reunite this continent and move forward, a continent that is very rich in natural resources, human resources and other things. How can this continent move forward? How can we create a strong bloc? Will be under discussion this evening on To The Point. With us is Dr. Cherif Amir, who is a professor of geopolitics at the University of Paris. A pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
I believe February 10th is the day that we will be officially starting the chairmanship of the African Union. Of course, when we go back maybe a couple of years ago when we were out of the Union, unfortunately for a short time, and now we're bracing ourselves to head, this shows a big jump. Egypt has not been very chummy with its African brothers. And as of late, since the president came to office, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, he is focusing more on Africa-Africa relations. What do you think is the priority for Egypt? And when I say priority for Egypt, not just for us, but a priority to present, to reform this continent.
The priority is something which is happening in the whole world and giving us a clear message, is that we have to endorse cooperation, because we cannot anymore as African continent depend on the outside world as it happened years before. We are witnessing now that even in Europe there is social economic problems. They're not capable now of helping all the countries, as they say by themselves. They say we cannot have any more immigrants because we have our own problems. So everyone is minding of his own problem. The same thing with the United States. The political administration of Donald Trump is aiming at restructuring America from the inside. So it's time that we work with ourselves and accept the fact that we have this mission today. In order to start this kind of cooperation, we have to have many elements. First of all, leadership. For my respect for all the leaders, African leaders, from South Africa till Morocco and the north, we have President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who is the one who is capable of bringing up these kind of challenges to the Africans, that they have to work. We started it here by telling the people here in Egypt, and we are telling it to our friends in Africa. So first of all, the leadership is to have this kind of strong relations. And he was the first Egyptian president to go to Rwanda, where there were the genocide. And he was also the first one to start tackling the Ethiopian problem which we had. We have boycotted Addis Ababa for years, and he was the first Egyptian president to restart this dialogue. Endorsing relations with African leaders like Yoweri Museveni of Uganda. Why this structure is taking place and why the leadership is needed? Because I think that at some time our friends in Europe and other parts of the world will need someone who would speak on behalf of the Africans and these kind of problems. That's why when the Austrian European Summit, European African Summit took place in Austria, President Sisi was invited because he's a spokesperson now for these kind of issues for Africa. Same thing for the Libyan conflict. We have played a huge role. No one in Europe understood that the downfall of Libya will cause all these damage to the northern part of the Mediterranean with the refugees, with terrorism, with the illegal immigration, with the trafficking of arms.
They thought it was going to be restricted within Libya?
They will get the oil and that's it.
Yes.
No one got the oil and they got all the problems.
Yes.
I'm talking about everyone. So we said it from the beginning that we have to settle this kind of problem. So now the Europeans have an interest, especially in Italy when they have the Palermo summit, and once again President Sisi was invited. Remember when it took place, the war against Libya in 2011, there was always Turkey and Qatar as representatives. Now I think that they understood that Egypt is the best partner to talk with. So the leadership now is a kind of a message that someone could represent this continent in a way that there will be mutual interest, not only that we need the help of Europe, no, Europe also need that things will settle in Africa. There is another point also, is the investment that is taking place inside Africa, and we have the Chinese, we have the Russians.
Exactly.
They are present. They're inaugurating local businesses inside Africa, and the people there are benefiting from it. This never happened in the history of Africa, that an external power came in and gave a benefit to the people.
Yes.
So this is an important fact that we should tell everyone, that there is future in this continent. If we neglect the projects and the economic development in this continent, the problems will be bigger and bigger for Europe. And let me tell you why I'm speaking of Europe, because of the colonial history that took place, because of the miscalculations that happened in several years. For example, Europe considered that once they will have this kind of bloc and they will have integrated Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, all these countries within the Union, there will be a great force. Now, these three countries that I've said, and they have a very important place in Europe, they refuse to obey, let's say it like that, Brussels in all this, and they're doing. They don't want any immigrations. They don't want to profit or give any contributions for outside their countries.
Yes.
So now they have this kind of problems. So the only thing is to do is to preserve the peace and security in the continent and endorse economic projects.
Before we can talk about any social or economic reform, there is a phenomena that is unfortunately still present strongly in this continent that has to be overcome to be able to move forward, and that is terrorism.
Of course.
We have different types of terrorism, really, that is marring this region. How can we consolidate efforts to work on overcoming this? And I know the President is always talking about terrorism, and even Egypt within itself is leading a strong campaign against this. How can we overcome this big hurdle, so to speak?
First of all, as you said, different kind of terrorism. We have Boko Haram, we have Al-Shabaab in Somalia, we have still the fragments of Al-Qaeda, we have still some elements still unknown in Libya, and in Mali also. Concerning Egypt and its role in that, I could say fortunately and unfortunately. Unfortunately, we were hit by terrorism. Unfortunately, we gained experience.
Yes.
So Egypt now has a strong role in combating terrorism and giving the expertise to the African countries. We have seen, for example, what took place in Mali when some regions were attacked. The groups crossed the borders between the desert with Algeria and Mali. And some elements also crossed the borders from Libya to Tunisia to commit terrorist acts.
Yes.
And we had the problems also with the Libyans. I'm not talking about the Libyan people, I'm talking about terrorist groups who are trying to infiltrate our western borders. And fortunately, we have an excellent armed forces who have the mobility to how to target these pickups full of arms It's an untraditional war. We never saw it before. It's not a war of tanks, it's a war of pickups and light ammunition that is used. So, and it's very hard. So the problem is there is the cross-border attacks. And they cross-border from Somalia, they go to Kenya. They just had a few weeks ago a terrorist attack. People were taken hostages for several days in a grand hotel in Nairobi.
Yes.
So when we analyze the kind of terrorism that we're having in this continent, and we also have infiltration from Sudan, there is always this problem of crossing the borders. And why the terrorist groups are crossing the borders to make their attacks and go back to their hideouts? Because there is no cooperation, clear cooperation between the countries. So I think that Egypt now has a role also to talk to the African leaders about cooperating, creating a task force. Why not?
I was just going to ask you, what about creating some kind of a force? Remember the idea that Egypt proposed to create this force, military for Arab NATO, so to speak, to defend the interests of the Arab nations. What about creating this African NATO, so to speak, to defend and to consolidate efforts?
It is more easier than the Arab NATO. Imagine. Why? Because first of all, we will not need heavy material. We just need special forces, and we have also the info, meaning the intelligence services will gather the info. For example, if we have, let's say, between Mali and Algeria, and they can have the intelligent info about some groups, they will be much easier to target them. So I think that the task forces, it will be smaller, but rapid intervention force. We have it here in Egypt, a rapid intervention force. And in France also, they have a rapid into all the countries. So we could have some similar forces in Nigeria, in Egypt, and they could train together. And believe me, it will be an incredible task force to combat terrorism. And it won't take much of effort because, as you know, the countries, the borders are mixed in a way that there is no different zones, meaning we don't have mountains, for example, and Africa has normal geography. And we know until now, for example, the attacks against Cameroon or Nigeria, we know where the Boko Haram hideouts are.
It's easier to trace.
Of course. It's not like Afghanistan, for example, or Sinai, where we're doing an incredible work not to harm the population, the peaceful population, the civilians there. So I think that the task force will be an excellent idea. The gathering of intelligent info would be excellent also. But I repeat, still, there have to be a work between the leaders. That's why the first point I tackled was the leadership. There has to be a leader who would talk about these points with the African leaders. And I think that President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is a new kind of generation, a new generation of leaders who know the new dangers, who know that cooperation now will bring us safety tomorrow.
What about conflict resolution? Because you have a lot of boiling points in this region as well. And the reason I'm saying this because if we want to talk about any real reform, you really have to overcome those hurdles. You cannot have the tension in Sudan, you cannot have the catastrophe that's taking place in Libya and elsewhere. Conflict resolution, what can be done about this?
First of all, there has to be political will. We didn't mention, for example, the problems between Algeria and Morocco. There is huge tension between both of them, and each country is refraining from giving the intelligent info to the other country because they are boycotting each other. This cannot continue for a long time. And also the problems that take place between North and South Sudan. We have to, first of all, we have excellent relations with Juba, with the capital of, of South Sudan. They have to understand that they have to find a solution for the tribal conflicts that are taking place.
Yes.
They have to bring stability to their newborn state. There is also the problems in Somalia that was neglected forever. Now we have to, when you go back to history, in the 1980s, before the American intervention, Somalia was a port with so much luxuries, and they were a very respectable state. And now it's a failed state, as they call it. Libya is the same thing. So the conflicts should be resoluted first between the African nations, and then it will be presented to the UN. So we can find resolutions that will abide all the countries to obey it.
Yes.
But we all know that always there's the external influence from whether the Americans or whether from the Europeans. And of course, there's also now present the Russians. The Russians, for example, I'll give you an example. They are in Central Africa, the state of Central Africa, and the French forces are there. And there was a message given by the French to the Russians: back off from this part of ours. It's not part of France, but they still have this mentality.
Yes.
So let's not forget that there's always strong presence, even in Mali, of foreign troops. There's the CENTCOM, which is an American central command in Africa, or AFRICOM. So we have this challenge also. If we want to have conflict resolutions, we have to talk with the Americans and the Europeans to see how we bring stability.
Education. Educational reform. Strong curriculums that develop.
Well, you have the African youth. They're still convinced that the future of education is in Europe, and they go to Europe. Even in Egypt, we had all this dream from years ago. But
how can we stop this brain drain? How can we revamp the educational system within this continent to avoid?
There is no harm to copy other countries' examples. There is no harm in it. Let's say, for example, there is here in Egypt a French university, Canadian university, German university, American universities. We have to have this
What about the strong African university?
Well, we had it, Leopold Senghor University in Alexandria. It was for the African youth, but then I don't know why it all came to nothing after all. They didn't go to Alexandria to learn there. It was a hub. But I don't think that the Africans now, the African youth, are still, this generation, are still convinced that their future of education is there. I think that this is the role of the Europeans also. If they want to stop this kind of immigration at any moment, they have to start these kind of universities inaugurated in
but they need
countries.
When we say they stop, unfortunately they need birth rate in Europe is on the decrease. Certain countries, Germany for example, needs a handful of engineers. I mean, they're selective even about which fields they want people from, and it's only the top that is taken outside. So why should they stop? Is it they stop, or we revamp the educational system so that we build here?
It will happen sooner or later that Europe will have to stop, because the social crisis, although they need, yes, some in some fields, engineers and other expertise, but still Europe is examining a hard time now, internally and in security level and the social level. And I don't think that they look at Germany after Angela Merkel will finish her mandate. It was written in an article that the damage is done. The person that will take her place afterwards will have a huge crisis, because we didn't speak about integration. It's easy to take people inside, but if they're not integrated, they will always have this cultural problems inside Europe. And cultural problems will create more and more internal problems. The Europeans are depending now more and more on robots and technology. So when you go, for example, in the factories of BM and Mercedes and all these kind of factories, it's all done by not handmade. They used to ask for the Algerians and the Moroccans and the Turks to come because they needed people.
Now it's more automated. You're
course.
reducing the manpower.
Yeah. So this will take place, and even the indigenous people, the local people are here from in France. They're saying that a computer is replacing us in everything. So meaning that at any time they will lose their jobs.
Yes.
So this will happen sooner or later. It will happen. So the African nations should think that at the moment they will be, I'm sorry to say it, but stuck with their own youth. You have to feed them, you have to keep them in your own country and find them jobs. And in order to find them jobs, you have to find education.
Qualify them.
Of course, you have to provide them a future. This is a great challenge. I think that President Sisi in the press conference with his counterpart Macron, he said it. He said we have 100 million and we have to ensure for them security.
This is just in Egypt.
Yeah, yeah.
This is just in Egypt.
Just in Egypt. So that's true. We cannot depend that they will go to the Gulf states and then they go to Europe. Because, as I said, every country now is closing its borders and minding in order their own problems. They know in just a decade they won't take anyone else. So this problem is our problem in the continent, and we have to work on it, whether we like it or not.
To the point, this continent has been exploited since I don't know when. How can we change that trend? How can we change the fact that some are here to take rather than develop, to sap rather than build?
What's really funny is that it's not us who will change it, but the Chinese. How? They came and they had this new idea that we will build factories, use your mines, use the gold, use the uranium and everything, and you will work with us. We will have our benefit. You will take your benefits win-win situation.
But maybe the Chinese are one of the few that propose this win-win formula. Others are not interested in win-win. It's win only.
The Chinese are working on it as a long strategy. They're waiting, for example, that we will work on the sector of the canal, of the Suez Canal, and they have guaranteed their places there. So they have a plan. And I think that, of course, as you said, there's another problem is the language problem also. The Chinese and the Chinese culture was never known to the people of Africa. The French is known, the British is known. So I think that this would happen with time, and I think that it won't be easy. Because maybe I said it before in this program that someone called Gabon the gas station of France. They take the gas and that's it. And of course they want to lose these resources. But still, till when and how these powers will have this, will maintain these local points? Because when I speak about China, China is an economic giant now. At a certain time, all these countries, including the United States, they have a debt towards China. And I think that there will be blackmail, political and geopolitical blackmail afterwards. And they will progress more and more in these countries. And there will be a reduce of the influence of Europe. So, and also the Russians are present there. So we have this change that will take place, that in a certain time you will see a new power within the continent. The old powers, if they are continuing or not, this is a question of their own problems in the Union. For example, if the EU will scramble. They're trying to maintain it, like the Brexit and all that.
Yes.
They're trying to maintain. If it will scramble one day and it will fall down, I don't think that all these powers will be able to work and exploit Africa. They will have a huge problem in the inside, and they will have to work on it culturally, security level, socially, and everything, and then work on the outside. China is a very close society and very organized, and this is typically Europe, how it was, as you said, years before. It was in the 17th century and the 18th century. There were huge blocks with huge armies, and they came to these unknown places and exploited it. Once you have the decline from the inside, you won't be able to have your power outside.
Women. This is a continent whereby over 50% are females. Indeed, they made progress. In some countries, they took huge strides. Egypt is one of them. But we're still way behind.
This is a huge problem that the UN is trying to find a solution for it. But Africa has its own mentality, because it's tribal mentality.
Yes.
And the tribal culture is very, very difficult to understand and to resolve. To tell them there's a woman that would take charge, I don't think that's easy. But I think that with the social development and economic development, they will need all the working people. I mean, the women and men. Look, for example, Germany, during the Second World War, it was all the women working underground for the ammunition in the armies. It was the women who were doing this job because circumstances forced them to do so. So I think that the same thing will happen sooner or later in Africa. That circumstances, not necessarily war, but economic development, will make people work. And I think President Sisi is one of the rare African leaders who's always tackling this problem about the continent, saying that the role of the Egyptian women and also in Africa is very important.
Yes.
That's why we're inaugurating these kind of conferences with the young people in Sharm el-Sheikh, because he wants to deliver this message that the future of Africa will be built by the hands of Africans, young women, young men, whether they like it or not. We are condemned to do it, and we have to do it.
A few years back, we were out. Today, we're talking about sharing. How far have we come?
It's an excellent job of the diplomacy. We're not saying words, we're doing things. You have seen how we were cast out of all this African Union job, and how the humility of President Sisi, that he took the plane and he went to Niger. I remember very much. He went to Niger and he met the leaders there, and he said, we want to start with you a new page, explain our case. And the president of Niger, he went to Addis Ababa and he said, I spoke with President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, things should have to change. And then President Sisi went to Algeria. I remember very well how he started this plan.
Yes.
And then he went to Algeria, and then he started negotiations with the Ethiopians. They were surprised that we're acting so. They thought that Egypt will be out for decades. Egypt was in a matter of months, and now we are the chairman. It's very, we are proud to say that diplomacy, the Egyptian diplomacy of Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry, who's focusing on Africa and all this, it's a huge job. We have shown also to the Africans how we worked on Libya, how it could have been a huge disaster for all the continent, not only for Europe, but we still worked on it. They found that Egypt has a relation. That's what I always say, that President Sisi, when he talks about the African states, he says our brothers. It's a relation of brotherhood. We are still mending all the bridges with our brothers in Ethiopia, although we were at two steps of disaster with them.
Yes.
How we turned everything towards our side. We are working with South Sudan. We're not neglecting anyone. We are working for the good of Africa. And I think that they understand it now. And I think that the charisma of the President Sisi helped a lot, because when you have an honest partner, and these countries, they have old leaders and they're not easy to manage.
Yes.
So they analyze the personality which is talking to them. When they sat down with President Sisi, they understood that they are talking to someone who's patriot, who loves his country, and who has no intention of any conflicts with anyone within the continent of Africa.
Yes.
And that's why they accept all the invitations to come to Egypt. Yoweri Museveni was one of the historical leaders, as we say, of Africa. He came to Egypt, and he was very proud to start a new page with us. He knows very well these kinds of leaders to work with or not. So I know that this time, when we will be chairman of the African Union, the AU, things will be much better for the African continent, because for the first time, we as Egyptians, we are suffering from the same challenges and the same problems as the Africans. I mean by that, terrorism, economic development, growth of population.
Yes, we all have the same problems. So we need to find a unified solution to the same problems.
And we have excellent relations with the European Union.
Yes.
They know that we have combated the illegal immigration. We have stopped it. And we are an honest partner in fighting terrorism. We're bringing stability in the east of the Mediterranean for the gas fields.
Yes.
We are working on several topics, exchanging of info between the intelligence services to combat terrorism, to combat human trafficking, everything. And in comparison with a partner like Turkey, which made blackmail with them, we didn't do it. So we had a policy of honesty and a great deal of professionalism. We showed that we said we will fight terrorism, we fought terrorism, we'll fight the illegal immigration, we did it. So I think that we are the best spokesman now. And history wants it like that. We were the cornerstone of Africa, and we still are. And I hope that, as I said, the internal problems between the African states like Algeria and Morocco will be settled, because we need a unified front against all these challenges.
Egypt is part of two important organizations, the African Union and the Arab League. Most of, a good chunk actually, of the countries that are in the African continent also happen to be in the Arab League. And unfortunately, this is where most of the conflicts are as well. How can we get those two organizations to work hand in hand for conflict resolution, really, and combating problems like terrorism? Is it possible that Egypt can play this role of being this liaison between those two big organizations?
Of course. Of course. Look, for example, in the Libyan conflict, we had the assistance of our friends, of our brothers in the Emirates. They helped with the reconstruction of the Libyan army. They guaranteed that we can consider them as funding for all the operations to fight terrorism there. So we had this relation between we were the liaison between the Emirates and Libya. And I think also that concerning Djibouti, where there is a huge now center of a military base for China there, I think it's part of the African Union and part of the Arab League. So I think that we are telling them also that the security of the Red Sea is important. So we are the liaison, we have good relations with all the countries that are working on this part in order to stop any infiltration from any hostile countries, and I mean by that Iran, and to secure the relations, and we are cooperating with the Chinese also on that. So I think that Egypt has a huge role in this kind of mediation. I think that also the question of Western Sahara, which is a great problem from Morocco, I think that they consider themselves as Arabs also. Lots of them are from Mauritania also, which is part of the Arab League and the African League. Yes. So I think we can mend these problems within the two unions. If Morocco doesn't want to take part of the African Union, but they're still in the Arab League, we can still find a way to negotiate with them for these problems within the Arab League, and then it will be benefit for Africa.
Yes.
So Egypt has a central role in all that. And we always consider that there's South Sudan and North Sudan, but the security of South Sudan is a part we cannot put it aside from the security of an Arab country like Sudan. So we are always working on that. So the relation between the Arab League and the African League now, it's very, very tight. And from the bad side, let's talk about it like that, the same organized crime that is using the immigration or the refugees problem in Syria, they are using the same thing in Libya. So it's one organized crime, and we are trying to find a solution here and there.
Yes.
So it's a huge job. It's not, but this is the new world that we are living in.
Yes.
Everything is related. And at the end, as we said from the beginning, the Europeans never thought that they would be in the heart of the problem. I remember...
They thought it was far away.
Of course. Well, someone said in France a few days ago, during the demonstrations of the Yellow Vests, he said, we have a problem of refugees. And then he said, well, why from the beginning we started bombing other countries? Why we started financing groups in Syria?
To end up with a refugee problem.
Yeah. He said, we bombed Libya, and then we had the refugees. We bombed Syria, then we had the refugees. And now we're doing it with Yemen. And he said, well, we are creating all these problems. So if we haven't bombed Libya or bombed Syria, things would have maybe better.
Exactly. Dr. Cherif Amir, unfortunately our time is up. I'd like to thank you very much for your fruitful input. I'd like to thank you, the viewers. We'll see you same time next week. Until then, good night.